Welcome to the Sacred Speaks. My name is John Price. I'm your host. And today I will be quick, I hope. But sometimes I just hit tangents I just can't avoid. So, first of all, today's guest is Dr. Marguerite Regalioso. And two of her books that I have, I read another one, but the first is Virgin Mother Goddesses of Antiquity. And the second new release came out on April 7th. It is The Mystery Tradition of Miraculous Conception, Mary, and the Lineage of Virgin Birth. She runs a community called the Seven Sisters Mystery School, and I'll include all the links below for you to reach her. I highly recommend checking her out. Certainly, if you're involved in anything miraculous, looking at the miraculous. So, part of the Christian mythology around Mary is the virgin birth, and Marguerite does an incredible job at researching this. So, I was excited to meet her. Brian Marescu introduced us and said that she's one of the high priestesses of the mysteries traditions. So it was exciting to read her work and to connect with her. So Marguerite, thank you for participating in the podcast. I'm glad to know you. Just a couple of laundry list issues that I want to address before we get to the interview. First of all, The Sacred Speaks, check it out at thesacredspeaks.com. And there's a lot of new cool things coming on, including a YouTube series starting in the next 2-3 months. So I'm eager to begin that. The second thing is check out the website and look it up. If you're new to the project, thanks for investigating so far, and you can check out all kinds of information that I have on that website. New website coming along soon. The Sacred Speaks is brought to you by the Center for the Healing Arts and Sciences. It's a boutique integrative practice that my wife, Leila Scott Price, and I started. Check us out at thecenterforhaas.com, THECENT, or just look there. But if you're listening, THECENTERFORHAS.com. The music for The Sacred Speaks is from Modern Nations. Check them out at modernnationsmusic.com. And I think that kind of is it for now, other than a class I've been talking about for a long time. I'm going to be teaching at the Young Center at younghouston.org. Check that out. There's a link below to the class. It's the class is called How to Die Before You Die, and I am riffing off of a phrase that Brian Marescu introduced me to that he has at the beginning of his book. We're going to investigate his book, but also look at some of the tendrils that this podcast has been looking at. Certainly the Immortality Key, but also The Road to Eleusis, the book by Carl Ruck. If you haven't seen that interview, check that out. It's the last interview I posted. Dr. Carl Ruck is featured in Brian's book, and his story is fascinating and important. Dr. Bill Richards, Dr. Tony Bossis, a number of folks that I have been talking to on these subjects of religion, mystical traditions, psychedelics, spirituality, and the ways in which we can look at alternate states of consciousness to start to understand who we are as human beings and what we're doing in the world. It's kind of a humanistic tradition. So I'm eager to jump into this, and Brian will join us either the second or third class to answer questions that people have in the audience or in the Zoom audience, and it'll be 4 Tuesdays. So starting April 27th, the class is from 5:45 to 7:15 Central Time. Click on the link below to log to get into the class. You can join the first class or the fourth class. It's fine. But of course, you'll miss out all the funny jokes and the important deep dives that we'll take. If I know we will, I just had a conversation with Brian, and I'm excited to mine through this territory with him. If you're listening to this on audio, there is now a YouTube portion to The Sacred Speaks. Go search YouTube, or go to YouTube, search The Sacred Speaks, and you can be linked to the videos that I'm putting out. Certainly subscribe to the page, like what you can. It all helps as it's growing. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can do the same on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify. The podcast is out there for everyone to listen to. But, as you like and kind of subscribe to these pages, it grows in its reach. So that would be much appreciated. And now we'll leave it there. Marguerite Mary Regalioso is the foremost authority on the history of virgin birth and has taught graduate and undergraduate courses in both the United States and the United Kingdom. The founding director of Seven Sisters Mystery School, she's the author of The Cult of Divine Birth in Ancient Greece and Virgin Mother Goddesses of Antiquity. Her new book is The Mystery Tradition of Miraculous Conception, Mary and the Lineage of Virgin Births, which is the inspiration for our conversation today. That was nice. Thank you. I'm glad you're here.
Thanks. So good to be here, John.
For those of you listening, Marguerite and I have already sat in meditation and silence together. So if you need to collect yourself for a moment, press pause and just connect your feet to the ground if you want to get on our level.
It's
uh,
an
yes. Well, good. I know. So Mary is, of course, going to be the conversation today. And given the correspondence that you and I had, you know my interest in Persephone also. I've just shared a conversation last week with Dr. Ruck, and we explored Eleusis, and that was lovely. So just to kind of position our conversation, there's no need to pick that thread up, but just so you can know for the listeners, that's kind of where we've been swimming around, is in mystery practices and psychedelics and entheogens and all that depth and underworld stuff. So I'm eager to explore this. I've got a number of questions, but of course I want to throw a pretty basic, just wide net out there. And as you said, there is a theme of virgin birth and the goddess that goddesses that interweave through all your material. I wonder if you just talk a little bit about that, and let's tee this up in a way that people can kind of start to understand where you're coming from and where we're going.
Yes, absolutely. And a natural segue between your talk about Persephone, whatever you discussed with Carl, and myself is that, in addition to being a scholar, I've also been what I call a practitioner of the ancient Mediterranean mystery traditions. And what does that mean? That means that I have done quite a bit of ceremony over the past 20 years, with and without using kind of light level opening up medicines.
Mm-hmm.
And during those journeys, I received that the first my first goddesses were Demeter and Persephone, and that I was first and foremost what you might call a priestess of Persephone. And the way that looked like in my personal life is that, like Persephone, at an early age, I was separated from my mother. My mother died when I was 10. I went into a long underworld journey, that I think I've emerged from. I don't know. But and so those goddesses were the first ones that I really tuned into as realities. Like, oh my gosh, these beings are real. I went from being, scholar and reader and hopeful, like, why am I so fascinated with this, to, oh gosh, these are consciousnesses, these are intelligences, these beings have lives, they have realities, and our lives can parallel them. And mine, in fact, did. And the other thing that segues about Persephone, and so a lot of what I've been looking at is underworldly phenomena of this world and the other world, obviously. And the darker side, the more negative side, what's it all about, right? So
Well, let me before you go there. Let me interrupt. Sorry, you said real. These are real, and when you've been initiated into a particular tradition, our language really matters. And what one person hears when we say the word real and what another one hears are two very different things. And can you speak a little bit about what it means for a god or goddess to be real?
yeah, so for me, it went from reading about them as like fictional characters
Mm.
to actually being able to communicate with them, and to actually understand that we can live their journeys and their archetypal paths in our own lives. So um they are communicable to use the word in this present time. They're communicatable beings. They're intelligences. They're live. You can talk to them. You can go to their sites. You can just with a flick of your mind be in communication and conversation. So when that relationship with the gods starts, then you're really on a very interesting path. Then you've started opening into the other realms, which have both its positive and its negative valences. And Persephone has both. She's the goddess who knows the underworld pretty well. And she's also the goddess of springtime. So she knows the above ground. She knows the hope, all of that sort of thing. And also, she has a virgin birth story, right? As does her mother. In my those two earlier books, The Cult of Divine Birth in Ancient Greece, but especially Virgin Mother Goddesses of Antiquity, I really tease out this idea that, hey, you know what? That story about Demeter consorting with Zeus and giving birth to Persephone might be kind of a distortion or a later picture. I was discerning that Demeter was able to give birth to Persephone out of herself without the help of a male. And so, you know how the traditional story of then Persephone's abducted by her uncle Hades and brought into the underworld. What I write all about is that Persephone was in the process of actually doing a divine conception ritual to give birth to the next generation, the next iteration of her female line, when she was abducted, when she was taken over, and when she was essentially raped. And so we're talking about deep esoteric concepts here, but this is starting us to go into the realm of divine birth through the Greek tradition. And eventually we will lead to Mother Mary, but there's this whole background of divine birth that I discerned from my research in the first book, where I was looking at not only goddesses but then their priestess representatives. And what I realized through piecing together and going through many, many ancient texts, historical, mythological, legendary, that there were these groups of priestesses that were able to conceive and give birth in different ways, and from the normal, sexual intercourse between man and woman. And that the reason for this was always because the nature of that kind of a divine conception allowed for a specialized human being to come into incarnation, one that would be very beneficial for humanity. And of course, the practice could be used to create negative beings that had sort of superpowers, but they weren't as positive as, some of the more beneficial ones. So we have these stories on the mythological level, but we also have them on the historical level in Greece. For example, our beloved Plato and Pythagoras were said to have been divinely born by their mothers. Okay. Perictione with Plato and Pythias with Pythagoras. And she, it seems, was probably a Delphic oracle. You see, so these oracle centers often were connected with virgin birth. And you find that by looking at the names of the places and the cities. Oftentimes, they will either be names of female priestesses who gave birth in a divine way, or their names of their children. And this is all over the ancient Europe, the ancient Mediterranean world. And there was a process by which this practice kind of devolved and was taken over and eventually hijacked by the patriarchal priesthoods. And then it was used, for different kinds of purposes, and essentially was the entry point by which some of the patriarchal heroes entered in and started dismantling female-centered, balanced cultural behaviors and practices, matriarchy, if you will. So that's just a little bit of a kind of a background, and I'll let you kind of take it from there. Where do we want to go or dive in?
Well, the first thought was that it's a part of my tradition is Jungian, and what's fascinating to me is that I've got on my desk a bunch of the collected works of Jung, but I've got this book right there called the Red Book, and it reads like whether it's Revelation or any stories in the Old Testament. One of the things Jung talked about is that you really need to turn towards these kind of inner figures and treat them as if they are real. And he wouldn't even say as if, he would say they are real. Treat them as such. And we're starting to get a little bit of that in neuroscience. I mean, whether you've got Anil Seth, who's talking about how there are consciousnesses in our in our psyche, or Jill Bolte Taylor, who's talking about this confrontation with an inner other when she had a stroke, that the idea that we have this counsel inside of us that we can turn toward and interrogate, because it's interrogating us, is somewhat difficult to grasp given the current worldview of what a human is and what psyche is and what consciousness is. So I cued in on that because I think it really needs to be positioned at the outset, which is our definition of real really matters here. And if I can be taken over by an impulse, by rage, by lust, by greed, by jealousy, and do things that I don't know where that came from. I don't usually behave that way. That's just a hint at these other forms that exist inside, and that if we don't turn to it and relate with them, then they'll act out in an unconscious way. And I think this is what this whole process of self-knowledge is about. How am I tracking so far with how you're...
Very much so, very much so. And I think there's, let's distinguish between ontological reality, meaning these beings have their own life, their own reality, whether we're here or not. We can tap into them or not, versus seeing them all as inner parts of self, which, on some of the esoteric Buddhist understandings, if I'm understanding this correctly, is that it's all us, right? It's all our mind. It seems like separate beings, but it really is all us. And so it depends on how you want to look at it. I have found a lot of utility in feeling like these beings have their own ontological reality, that out there is Demeter doing her thing. I can connect with her or not. Persephone the same, Mother Mary the same, Jesus the same. But how they interact with us is they are helping us to cultivate the part of ourselves within us that is like them or capable of becoming like them. The part of us that is capable of becoming divine, like raising to the level of a really high level master who is able to traverse three-dimensional reality and come into incarnation like Jesus and Mary, and who is also able to merge with the goddess and Godhead, which is what, in my belief structure, Mary has done and Jesus has done. So that's just a little further conversation. And then in terms of like these experiences that we had where we are saying where we say to ourselves, what was that? Who was that? In my reality structure, there is a multiplicity of beings on the other side of the veil from our three-dimensional reality. They are legion. I mean, more numerous than the drops of water in the ocean, right? And they range from very high vibrational to very low vibrational. And anybody who does enter into the shamanic realms in a high altered state experience will come in contact with these beings, the good, the bad, the ugly, the intermediary, the ones who are learning, the ones who are out to make trouble. And a lot of these beings do connect with us and hook into us, the negative ones. And this is a big, huge discourse about, what's going on, who's really in charge of our body. The fact that okay, if we do agree that there are these energies, sometimes called entities, then that puts mental health and remedies about mental and emotional disturbances in a whole new light. And I have always wanted the psychological and psychiatric establishments to treat things on the emotional, physical, and spiritual levels, you know. And I've been trained in energy depossession, you know. It's not a work that I like to do anymore. I give it back to my teacher, but there's stuff going on, right? You know, so when we open into this, we open into the whole wide world. And so these virgin birth priestesses are so important because these are some of the highest vibrational women who've been on the planet. And they know when they're in there doing the process right, they know how to incarnate a really high vibrational being. Sometimes we call it an avatar. And was one, but Plato was one, Pythagoras was one. You know, there are other examples of these high level beings, and then there are other examples of low level beings who came through this virgin birth way. For example, I would say Alexander the Great. He has a virgin birth story. But this is a later phase of the virgin birth where I was initially talking about parthenogenesis, the woman self conceives, and then boop, you know, the baby comes out. There's a later stage where she starts cavorting in three-dimensional reality with a non-three-dimensional being, an interdimensional sexual relation. And this is shamanically attested to worldwide. Um, Lewis talks about this. You know, there's research on this. But what happened is these women who used to be able to give birth parthenogenetically start kind of consorting and getting seeded by these interdimensional beings through a ritual. Okay. And then in a later stage of that, so in a later stage of that, we have a male who will come in and incorporate that God through his physical body. So there literally is a human sexual connection there with sperm. And but it's the God's energy that's coming through that. It's the God's child. But because a male is involved, they can take that child into the male lineage now. And so all of the female empowerments and matriarchal groups that once kind of controlled this practice are disempowered. So, you know, the Egyptian pharaohs were said to have been birthed that latter way. And as I said, in the Greek tradition, some of the more questionable legendary ones that came in were Theseus, Perseus, and Heracles. You know, the stuff that we usually think of as, oh, you know, fictional stories, let's make a movie about them, they're not real. But in my belief structure, they were real. They actually existed. These stories are describing actual histories. Those men were three-dimensional. And you know, they were born in a negative way by women who were intervened with by negative energies, namely some of the male gods of the Olympian pantheon. Okay, so it's a very complicated, complex. We're sort of diving into the deep end of the pool, but I feel like you can certainly handle it, and probably your readers will, or your listeners will be, you know, kind of listening to it at whatever level, and maybe going back and maybe taking a look at my books and seeing things. But let's see if we can help them understand or tease it out.
Yeah, because it brings up a certain binary that I think it comes up for me, certainly. I fall into a literal versus symbolic interpretation framework, you know, and so I noticed that and it's all in question. I told a good friend of mine yesterday where I was like, man, I can't tell what is literal and what is symbolic anymore. And so then I do things like, in anticipation of you and I talking, I'm looking up parthenogenesis and trying to say, where does this show up? And of course we can find evidence for that in various animal groups. So I want to talk about that a bit. But before we tend to that, let's tend to this a little bit, which is, you know, you have a listener out there that's going, what is this hocus pocus? This is crazy talk. How do you make sense of or understand that literal versus symbolic dynamic that I certainly get caught up in?
Right. Well, you know, I usually say to those people, take 2 mushrooms and call me in the morning. You know what I mean? And this is where Brian Murarescu's work comes in, because his book, The Immortality Key, you interviewed him. I mean,
Yeah.
that guy is showing all the priestesses throughout time
Yeah.
who have been saying, hey, people, these folks are real, these beings are real. Here's some ivy, here's some mushrooms, here's some henbane, here's some whatever. Take it. Let's have an experience of them together. Let's go to the Eleusinian mystery. The Eleusinian mysteries was where they took the kukeon, the drug, and they had a communal with like 3,000 people in the basement of that temple having this experience of like, oh my gosh, these goddesses are real.
Yeah.
Right? You know, my initiation really was through the sacred medicines. You know, I had a partner 20 years ago who introduced me. He was my teacher, Robert Owings. He's got a book called The Call of the Forbidden Way, which, you know, in a way is
Mm.
like an expose of all that. But when I first did my mushrooms, I was like, oh my God, these beings are real. Like you just know. And things that for you were fascinated by and you were so attracted to, but you couldn't make that breach. You know, you couldn't breach the realms, right? And now all of a sudden here you are breaching the realms and here they are. And you're like, whoa, in your visual field, but more than in your visual field, they're in your knowing field. And you know they are real beyond the shadow of a doubt. Now, some people are able to do this without that, like you're saying, your beloved Jung. You
Mm-hmm.
know, I went to a lecture online a few weeks ago at the Jung, one of the Jung Institutes in Berkshire County or something. And I, I'm listening to them going, wow, because the talk was about Jung and entheogens and things like that. And I put in the chat, okay, please, like Jung must have been doing sacred medicines. And somebody wrote back, no, he absolutely didn't. He actually was against it, you know, didn't believe it. But he had that natural capacity, right? And hence the Red Book, but hence why it was repressed from being
Mm-hmm.
published until after his death, because it seemed so crazy, like you're saying. It seemed so crazy and wild. Now, so for a lot of people, sacred medicines are the entree to this. For some people, other means of opening consciousness, it could be ecstatic dancing for 24 hours, you know, Sufi dancing, fasting. Fasting is a typical one. You will tend to go into an altered state. People who go on those vision quests, they're like, whoa,
Yeah.
you know, this is why they get the message about day 4 or 5, because they have opened into an altered state of consciousness where the deities and the beings are real. Um, you know, there are many other methods for going in and for opening expansions. For some people, it's simply meditation. Like they go into these deep, what is it, delta vibrations, and they suddenly the veils between the worlds become really thin. Now, also bear in mind that I have trained myself. I went to a psychic training school for several years, and then I continued to do the practice for more than a decade now of doing a running energy meditation which opens your consciousness, your upper chakras, your third chakra, your crown. And you are thus able to get direct downpours of information that you're like, wow, this is truth. I know this. I don't even know how I know this, but I know it, right? So intuition becomes alive. And like you were saying recently, you're like, I don't know what's imaginal and what's real anymore. Well, guess what? The times we're in are fostering that. The worlds are cracking. Third dimension is starting to merge into fifth dimension, and that's part of this world crisis. You know, there are negative energies that are happening along with it, but on one end, it's creating a lot of awakening for people as
But
they.
hasn't that been going on for, like, the apocalypse is something that we've been writing about, thinking about, has been in the aware, whether it's the calendar of this that ends or the time of that isn't that a consistent aspect to reality?
It can be, but at some points in the history of humanity, it's more poignant than others or more intense than others. And right now is a very intense node. And by right now, we could be saying the last few hundred or few thousand years, you know, like um, it's really intense right now. And a lot of people are saying that this is actually a pivot point. What we're in right now is a pivot point, and it's going to spell one road that we go down or another road that we go down.
Yeah, I guess my argument in favor of that is that for centuries, the apocalypse has been in the kind of imagination of humanity, except right now we've got some pretty solid evidence to the destruction and devastation that we're doing to the earth and the environment that I guess is one of the first times. I mean, certainly you had war and famine and all kinds of other realities that were very difficult to manage and catastrophic and tragic. This is interesting and different. And that if it was the death of a culture, that's one thing, but the death of the entire culture of the world because we've cut off our connection with the earth and devastated it, that just seems to be a little hypercharged.
Yeah, it is. And there are so many layers to it, and possibilities around what is actually really happening, that it might be a bridge too far to go into that today.
Yeah, I hear you.
But suffice it to say, the underworld is alive and well and doing its thing to try to get its coin, so to speak.
Yeah. So the a few questions because I want to get into Mary, but I want to do our job tending to this material first. The one aspect of certainly my conversations with both Brian and Dr. Ruck and Amin Hillman were about the tradition of the priestess pre-Christian and the relationship of the priestess with the witch post-Christian, I guess. Uh, and when I asked Dr. Ruck last week, we were talking about this collision of maybe the Roman Catholic Church, but maybe that is a signifier for another mode of consciousness. But when I asked him about what was going on with Christianity, pre-Christianity, pre-Catholic Christianity, and Catholic Christianity, was he said that Christians or the way were involved women and involved women in the process, and as Brian has articulated really well, it involved women in the presiding over the Eucharist or the ritual, holy ritual, and providing the sacraments. And of course, now we're talking openly about how those sacraments were entheogenic, consciousness expanding, or whatever material. So to actually have a religious experience was part of the process, not just to eat a wafer and say this is symbolic.
That's right.
So will you speak a little bit about priestesses, pre-Christian, and their involvement in religious traditions?
Yeah. I think that, what Brian has discovered and laid out is right on, and it corresponds with all my research and the research that many others have been doing about, what were these priestesses up to? Yeah, these were the seers. These were the knowers. These were the guides for humanity when humanity itself had degenerated from having an open third eye, open crown to see the other dimensions. These were the specialists that still allowed, they were the conduits, okay? Pre-Christian. Once Christianity came in, and what I mean by that is not mystical Christianity, because at the very beginning, Christianity was run by the women. It was run by Mother Mary. It was run by Mary Magdalene, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The men were having a little bit of a problem with that. We can see Peter reacting to that in a negative way. He was jealous of Mary Magdalene. But it really wasn't until a few hundred years into it, particularly the Council of Nicaea, where they lay out the creed and so forth, that the male priests, so called, totally took over. That was it. And they started making men the only ones who could deliver the Eucharist. Women had to be only nuns. They were completely stripped of their erotic connection and their divine birth knowledge, because those virgin nunhoods used to be the divine birth priestesses, which was a companion piece to being able to see is being able to conceive in the womb. You're conceiving in the mind, you're conceiving in the womb. These are priestesses who receive. And so, and you know, as Brian said, in the early, in Greek times and so forth, the women were the ones who were picking the plants, mixing the brews, and giving it to the people to have these religious experiences. Again, there was an energy that came into Christianity a few hundred years into it that put the clamp on everything. And there's been a lot of talk in esoteric realms about what those energies were. That again, I think might be a bridge too far for listeners here, but you know, you can, there's other people you can listen to about that. But let's just call it patriarchy for simplicity's sake. Mm-hmm. But I will just say that it involves some of those negative beings that I've been talking to you about. Okay. The points of light and the pods and pools of light on the planet get taken over by the negatives. And one by one, these things get hijacked and taken over. Whether it's the women's wisdom tradition with the medicines to help people open up, whether it's the divine birth practice, whether it's gurus who have this kind of knowledge and that kind of knowledge, and all of a sudden they get taken over and hijacked, and they're sleeping with their students and having Rolls Royces and things like that. Okay. These negative energies that are alive and well in and around planet Earth. Yeah. Hear that. Hello. They, you know, they're active. Okay. They're active. They're active. And this is why we have had a Jesus come into the world. This is why Mother Mary was like, hey, holy gosh, this earth plane is in trouble. We have got to do something now. And this is, you know, 2000 years ago or so. She was already part of a family. She was part of a lineage of women who still were somehow managing to maintain this wisdom tradition as seers, as medicine women, as divine birthers. And she was such a high level being that she was able to bring in the likes of Jesus to help this planet. He's not the first, he's not the last, but he's a major, major one who was supposed to come here to help us. Of course, in the illusion that that will be taken over immediately as well. And so it got twisted and turned around. So now we have dogmatic, abusive Christianity, and underneath it is still that mystical tradition, you know, that a lot of people are talking about and working with and still connecting with. And so it's a very mixed bag.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. So you're starting to move into Mary there, and I think that's important to do so, because my thought as you were talking was that in the narrative that many people know of Christianity, Mary is a pretty small part. She plays a small role. But in reading your work, you're positioning her as a more central figure, and of course being the one who gave birth to this powerful figure that was needing to come at that time. So would you give us a little background on why Mary is a much larger player in the narrative than, and so sorry, follow-up question is, and how she became the smaller character that we know her as today in general?
Well, let's start with how she became the smaller character, because that's kind of like our entry point.
Great.
The canonical Gospels, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, say very little about her. The Quran actually says more about her in Islam than those Gospels. Where we find, and that was, I believe, deliberate, again, part of this campaign to disempower women and make them really small. Now, Christianity has always had a little embarrassing fact that they couldn't get away from, which is that their symbol, Jesus, that they then came and used for various purposes, including, you know, his message got distorted, right? They could never get away from the fact of how he came onto the planet, which was through a divine birth priestess who willed it, planned it, was part of a lineage, etc. that is a very uncomfortable fact to, again, let's call it patriarchy. And so they did everything they could to diminish her in the Christian religion, writing her out of the official canonical gospels, calling any other texts that were written about her. And there were a number of them, one of which is what I based my book on, the Infancy Gospel of James, calling those apocryphal, saying that they're absurd, saying that they're not authentic, saying that they're not real. But there are biographies of Mary, Maximus the Confessor, his Life of the Virgin. There are other ones. So if you look in those neighboring kinds of texts, you can see who Mary is and where she came from, and the much bigger picture. So in this particular book, I focus on that Infancy Gospel of James, which originally was called The Birth of Mary, okay? Because it's really all about her infancy gospel, not James's infancy gospel. Okay, this is another thing. Scholars twist it around and obscure the name of Mary and the fact that it's about her birth and childhood and adolescence, coming into divine birth priestesshoodness, and they call it Infancy Gospel of James, so nobody ever looks at it. They're like, oh, whatever that is. So I rummaged around and found this thing, and I'm like, wow, all of the codes and descriptions and symbols here completely correspond with all the research that I did in ancient Greece about how these priestesses did it, the practices, the symbols, the stages and all that. So that's what this new book, The Mystery Tradition of Miraculous Conception, Mary and the Lineage of Virgin Births, is all about. It is my analysis of this infancy gospel where all the mother lode of information is about Mary, how she was born, who her parents were, what her childhood training was, her time in the temple, her conception of Jesus, and then the story of her giving birth to Jesus and then being on the run. Okay, it goes through that. So I have unpacked all of this, and I've connected it all with what I know from ancient Greece, what I know from ancient Iraq and Sumer, etc. So this is a big opening about Mother Mary. I mean, the implications are enormous, John, in the way that, are you familiar with the opening that's happened about Mary Magdalene over the past 2 decades? Yeah. This is the beginning of Mother Mary's opening reclamation. Okay. We went through Mary Magdalene. There have been everyone from channelers to scholars writing about Mary Magdalene, her gospels, her reality, what was her real relationship to Jesus, how she was a really powerful priestess, etc. So, okay, Mary Magdalene, it was a little easier for us to swallow because she was more like connected to humans, and Mother Mary always seemed way far away from us, like an untouchable. But what I'm starting to bring forth is Mother Mary as a very advanced human master who was actually at the end of her life able to transcend her human status and ontologically change into divine status, okay, through what she accomplished here and her ritual death. And some of that material is going to be in my next book, that will probably come out next year. So I'm applying a scholarly lens and all the background research, the tremendous research that I did on divine birth in ancient Greece, to Mary's gospel, and I'm able to unearth and shine the light on much of what happened to her.
What was the fantastic, by the way, and what was the process of becoming a priestess?
So, it depends on where and when. So focus me somewhere, whether would it be Mary or would it be the Greek priestesses or
both, either. I think that, well, maybe there's even a way to back that up further and say that let's maybe you tell me if we can go here first or not, but the mysteries, when people talk about the mysteries, what are they talking about?
Right. Well, that comes from a word that means to close, right? To close the mouth or something like that. Because it has to do with things that shouldn't be spoken, and moreover can't be spoken because you cannot necessarily understand it with linear three-dimensional thinking. You can only understand it when you enter into the open state of consciousness and the more what I call fifth dimensional awareness and so forth. So it's about connecting with the other world, the world beyond just this 3D realm, the world of spirit. And I would say, to address your question in the most basic way of how were these women trained, I would say through lineages. That's the thing. It wasn't just, like me. I was born in the Bronx, and all of a sudden I found a few people who influenced me. And then I'm like, hey, I'm on the priestess path. No, these women, yeah, because we have broken lineages.
Yeah.
All right. But interestingly, what I found is when I look back into my lineage, what did I discover? My great grandfather in Sicily was the town healer. Okay. I have lineage. It was broken. And of course, in his regard, it would have been deeply syncretized and Catholicized, but these people were trained in successive lineages by their mothers, by their grandmothers, right? By their aunts. So that was the main thing. It was kind of in their blood. It was in their family. They saw it all around them. They saw what was happening. They learned from a very early age what to do. Now, as it became a quote profession in ancient Greece, then there were more. Already the breakage was starting to happen, and there had to be kinds of temple trainings and things like that, and they were retrieving these girls from the countryside or retrieving these elder women from the countryside, and but presumably there was an education that would happen within the temple and so forth. So with Mary, we have the evidence for both, because she was born into a lineage of women who were seers and divine birth priestesses, because Mary was divinely born of her mother Anne. And that is what her gospel, the birth of Mary, aka Infancy Gospel of James, tells us. Mary was divinely born by her mother Anne, parthenogenetically born by Anne, Hannah, okay, while her husband Joachim was away in the desert. Okay, and that's a whole story about Anne, but she had been a lifelong virgin birth priestess who was trying and trying to have this pregnancy. She was in her elder years, it wasn't happening, and finally she and Joachim got really serious, and she's like, this has to happen. And so the gospel opens basically with her going to the laurel tree, which is, a symbol of the ancient oracular sites like at Delphi, and having a divine conception happen there. But I decode of what all the steps were that she had to do to get that conception to happen. And then what we see is that Mary then from infancy is trained. Okay. She cannot walk on the floor. Her mother takes her in to raise her as an infant in her room. She can never put her feet on the floor. If she does, there has to be a rug or something under there. And then when Anne has the priestesses of the Hebrew temple, yes, the Hebrew temple, come in and do things with Mary from the time she is an infant until she's 3 years old. They're training her. They're prepping her. They're probably they might be giving her even medicines. They're probably purifying her in different ways, teaching her things. And then when she's 3, she's given over to the temple. And then presumably those same priestesses raise her in the temple environment from there. So there's training, there's lineage. That's how it happens. There may be the use of sacred medicines in this training to open consciousness. And though, with somebody like Mary, who I think was so open coming into this lifetime after, in my belief structure, many, many lifetimes of having incarnated, she was very, very wise and advanced. Then she already had such a keen and strong opening. And that's why she was able to bring forth a particularly high vibrational avatar through her body, namely Jesus.
Yeah, I guess the thing that I'm thinking about also is this mother-daughter connection when it comes to, the question around who kind of fathered a child. And you made a comment in your book about, when a woman gives birth to a child, there's no question. And so there is certainly a line there that's pretty obvious. And when you then talk about the way that men are initiated and the ways that women are initiated, there are obvious differences, but what we tend to do is project our current culture onto a back then. And so I'm wondering what we when you teach this and through your education, what are our blind spots because of the zeitgeist, our current, what Jung called spirit of the times? What do we tend to miss?
Well, I think going back to the beginning of our conversation, we tend to miss the fact that there is another world that's parallel to this one. Those we've been so clamped down, um, and the lines have been so strongly drawn, and we've continued to be plied with things that will keep us dumbed down and not awake. Our pharmaceuticals, our forms of food now, right, are being completely always online, out of nature, which also can get us into these open states of
Mm-hmm.
consciousness. That's our main blind spot. In another culture, they would have never even said, "Are the gods real?" I mean, they would be laughing. That's like, it wouldn't even be a conversation, because it's like, of course they are. We're dealing with them every day. We're in communication with them through ritual. We're in communication with them in medicine. We're in communication with them in our dreams. They don't take away our problems, but they help us with them. And sometimes, if they're negative beings, they're creating more problems and we have to deal with it. So I would say that's the biggest blind spot, really. And then the other blind spot is, in the scholarly world, the scholars generally don't know what to do with anything that has to do with evidence of sexuality in the ancient world. And so, and this, the religion, programmed religion, has done the same thing. So that, one of the things I talk about in my new book is that Mary's experience of divine conception was a profoundly erotic situation. It was not, it had Kundalini fire
Hmm.
connected to it. And I talk about, my evidence to make that case. So that's one thing. Another thing that they miss is they miss the whole point of the whole Eleusinian mysteries, which I decoded it in my book, Virgin Mother Goddesses of Antiquity. Half the book is dedicated to the analysis of what happened at the Eleusinian mysteries. It has been crickets from the scholarly world. Um,
Well, you're
and
you're part of the lucky ones then, because a lot
right,
of
that's
people have been
right.
kicked out of the tribe.
Right, and I kicked myself out before I, whatever. But what is it that I say there? I basically say that at the apex of the Eleusinian mysteries, the initiates had to go through every single experience that the gods did and the goddesses did. So, what is that experience? They had to experience Demeter losing her daughter. They had to experience Persephone being raped. So, they had to experience that erotic encounter as the opening into the underworld. And that there were dildos
Yeah,
used.
that's where I was about to go. Yeah.
Okay, there were dildos used, and those dildos come into all the descriptions, and they're, but scholars have never known how to deal with that. And even colleagues that I've had that had a kind of a, like, you know fairy tale version of Demeter and Persephone, they got
Mm-hmm.
so incensed when they heard that I posed that this was the Eleusinian mysteries, that people had to go through like a self-induced rape to experience what Persephone went through, and that it was like a kind of a highly charged sort of erotic experience. I mean, they don't know what to do with that, but this is these are the kinds of blind spots when we look at this stuff. And I didn't go expecting to find that. I didn't go with an agenda. I'm going to look for the sex in, whatever the heck. it just emerged like, oh my gosh, you know, like you put all these things on the table, you start connecting the dots and you say, oh my God, I have to believe myself in my own conclusion here, right? So there's a lot of hot and intense stuff that went on in antiquity and that continues to go on for anybody who goes into a shamanic state. You know, I have clients all the time who are telling me about sexual encounters they've had with disembodied beings, etc. Okay? So Mary's thing though was she was not getting involved in this disembodied male god type thing, even though the gospel tries to say something like God overshadowed her, right? Or the spirit of holy, you know, will overshadow you. But really, Mary was involved in parthenogenesis. Her mother Anne was involved in parthenogenesis. There was not a male god involved in this rite, contrary to some of the other Greek and other priestesses who had degenerated the tradition. So Mary is a pure vessel using her own Kundalini power, her own eggs, and her connection with spirit, her deep, deep womb level training to be able to do this kind of conception. And therefore, she was able to pull in a very high level being.
So I want to kind of circle around sexuality for a second, because modern day, the most scholars and people that are writing on these subjects equate the body and sexuality with the feminine. And so we talk about certainly the body, mater, is it in, and I know in different cultures it's looked at different ways, but the way I hear it most commonly referred to is that the body and the feminine. And so there's something about our modern religious lives that are very repressed when it comes to one could say it's kind of a puritanical model where we're repressing our bodies. We try to transcend the body. We moralize sex and sexuality. We define it into these binaries. And so there's a lot of problems that we're having with sexuality, despite the fact that when I've taught sex and sexuality, one of my favorite quotes that's really tragic and obscene is that in Texas, there are a couple of counties that that the schools practice abstinence only in the stage of adolescence. So they teach abstinence only. And in those counties, they have the highest incidence rate of STDs and teen pregnancy.
Right, because good luck with that, right?
Yeah, good luck with that. So there's I want to go back to the dildos. I've talked more about medicated dildos in the past 3 or 4 weeks through this podcast than I have in my entire life. It's really been the past like 4 months. And you know, considering it's I read Michael Pollan's quote about, this is a Michael Pollan quote from Changing Your Mind or Change Your Mind, this book that came out that is, you know, radical. He's talking about witches and the broomstick, and the mythology around the broomstick is that the broomstick was a phallus, and the phallus was a dildo, and the dildo had medicine on it, and the medicine was one of these consciousness expanding medicines.
Right.
So
why? You know why? In part because when you take it through the stomach, it can make you nauseous. So it's better to do it through some form of skin. And the vagina, you know, immediately absorbs things. So it was very practical in a way, as much as anything else.
Well, and the anus from
right.
the
right. And the male initiates at Eleusis were doing that.
Yeah.
There was an orifice per gender, you know. Right. Pick
yeah.
your orifice to reach by. And, wow. You know, I mean, this is why I think the Christian writers commenting on the Eleusinian mysteries are the most useful, because they're like, what they do is obscene. It's this and that and the other. I'm like, oh, goody. Like they're telling us what happened. They're verifying what I've come to, right? Yes, it's obscene by certain perspectives, right? But they're all involved in a whole tradition that was several thousand years that came through lineages, and they were trained before they even went to the Eleusinian mysteries in the fall. The previous year, they had had a kind of a rough run training. And I know Brian, references that in his book as well, the lower mysteries, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah. And there's another example, and this is with Isis. Okay. Connecting it very much to the divine birth practice. First of all, Isis is another example of an elevated being who walked the planet, and she changed ontological status from human to divine because she was able to give birth to Horus in a seemingly counter-biological way. And here's the story. And also, there's another writer, and I have to look up this reference, but I don't know if it's Plato or who it is, or Plutarch says people didn't know whether Isis was human or divine. That's because she was one of those netters or whatever, like those beings who walk the planet. And so her story is that, and Rudolf Steiner believes, and I agree, that she was a previous incarnation of the woman we know as Mary. So Mary was like trial running this thing, right? But Isis's story is that her brother Set cut Osiris into many pieces, and Isis was able to find all the pieces except for the phallus. So what did she do? She made an artificial phallus, and I don't know if it was a golden phallus, whatever. And it was through that guess what? She was able to conceive Horus with Osiris already on the other side of the veil. That is an example of parthenogenesis through use of dildo. Mm-hmm. So whether there was medicine involved on that dildo, perhaps, we don't know. But I just think it's very interesting how the use of this sacred phallus, this lingam, human-sized lingam, comes in these various points where we're talking about the deepest mysteries of all. It's like the phallus and the yoni have to come together for these rituals on some level. And even in the parthenogenesis practice, meaning, the woman gives birth to a version of herself. In the revelation of Adam, one of the Nag Hammadi texts, it talks about one of the muses who goes off to the mountain, and she desires herself so as to become pregnant from herself. She becomes androgynous and desires herself. There is that activation of the male-female duality that will happen in the parthenogenetic woman. And this is what we see in some of the animals that you hear about, every once in a while, a lizard, mm-hmm. a shark, da, 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 whatever, or some of them that by nature are parthenogenetic. They have to have some aspect of the yoni and the lingam kind of coming together, which of course in the end is all the same thing. The yoni and the lingam in the fetus, it's all from the same tissue, right? And it either extrudes as a phallus or it, implodes as a vagina. Mm-hmm. It's kind of all the same thing. It's a yin yang, right? So there's like this deep mystery in all of this. And I think that people listening, hopefully they're listening with their third ear open, right? Because you and I are not talking in a linear way. We're not saying, oh, my book is about this. First, this happened, then that happened, then the history, we're going popcorn, do in a way. And I hope it's kind of waking, opening people's third eye where they go, whoa, oh my gosh, what is she talking about? Wow, what, some of that kind of resonates, or that's fascinating. This is my hope, that this just obliquely intrigues some people who might be listening to the deeper levels of mystery that in a way cannot be spoken.
Well, I think simply put, there's a certain homogenizing, if that's the right term, sameness. Culture culture on some level is creating some degree of sameness in people. And we can see this in the microcosm of the family system. The parents tend to unconsciously, on some level, consciously on others, enforce their worldview on their kids. And this isn't all a bad thing. I mean, I need to have an orientation. I need to have a way of being in the world. And I need to know how to go out there and become the person that I was created to be. But what can often happen is that when my unique expression is coming together with their idea of who I need to be, there's a tension that can be created in that. And if they're not conscious of what they're doing, they can really, really enact a lot of harm on the developing kid. But if they're able to see that that's a fact, and I pull it back, which is the work that certainly my wife and I do in our own personal lives as parents, is to try to take back our projections and not have to put them onto our kids. Well, let's blow that up into the macro and say that culture's doing that. And it's trying to kind of create a fertile ground for adaptation to the cultural desire, which can then create shame and dissonance in the individual or individual groups. So I certainly get that, that there's a pressure to be a certain way. And obviously religions have been, throughout time, religions have done that. They have enforced some ideal upon us. And I think one of the biggest hits is sexuality. It's certainly sexuality. It's also what I was talking to Brian about and have really been kind of going on about for a while is it's sex, it's drugs, and it's women. And we can look at what the current power structures are doing. I mean, whether we're talking about women reproductive rights or the war on drugs or, the intolerance of other people's religions, we're seeing it play out right now, which we don't need to go back in history to go, yeah, this is fucked up and this is happening. I don't know if I'm just kind of aligning with you. I don't know if there's a question there.
Yeah. Well, those three things that were hit, women's sexuality and drugs, again, from one viewpoint, that was deliberately done. That actually, when these negative beings started interfering with our planet, which you hear about in these divine birth stories, which you hear about even in the Bible with the sons of God who cavorted with the daughters of man and gave birth to the Nephilim, these giants. You hear these stories of these interdimensional shenanigans. And so there's been a lot of activity and intervention onto planet Earth. And what I've been tracking is that beings who want to kind of, negative beings who want to kind of have their way on an Edenic planet, which is what Earth was in my understanding to begin with, the first thing they had to go after was the relationship between women and men. They had to fracture that and create problems between women and men and distort the sexuality. And then they had to disturb anything that could continue to have people connecting with the otherworldly realms, the realms of wonder and mystery and co-creative possibility. So that was, plants, the drugs. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then women, because they still maintained these powers of seeing and these powers of divine birthing, they had to be tampered with. So all of these things have been tampered with. And, in my belief structure, it's not because of just human nature. Human nature was something completely other. It was a real divine blueprint. And it's because we have been enacted upon in this earth plane over a very long time by these negative interdimensional beings that we are in the intergenerational trauma situation that we are in. And we've so far been disconnected from what was the origin point, except on the part of various seers who are speaking about this, that we think this is just kind of normal the way it is. And it's like, okay, well, all we need to do is just do a little bit of self-love and do a little bit of, therapy practice. And, it's just like, it's going to be a lot deeper than that. Like, you're going to have to deal with the interdimensional level of what's going on here if this healing is going to happen, and if we're going to throw off the shackles, and if we are going to restore women's wombs and women's seeing and women's priestessing, if we're going to restore the connection with the drugs and the medicine, and basically meaning nature, and if we are going to restore the sexuality in a healthy way, and healthy male-female relationships, so that it's a wonder to be together and not a war.
Yeah, I mean, I think pleasure is certainly a part of that. And I catch me on this, because I'm wondering at some point, isn't there a battle between worldviews, like the hedonic worldview, the one that seeks pleasure and, kind of, I can do whatever I want whenever I want it. You can't live like that. You can't live in a culture together where I'm just setting my own pleasure and transcendence. I mean, I can't. I have to think there's some kind of wisdom on some level where we've been evolving. I mean, there at some. I mean, maybe last week I was talking to Dr. Ruck about the St. Paul saying, "You guys are doing this Eucharist wrong, man. You're abusing it. You've gone into recreational drug use." And it's a little like what happened in the 60s, which is what everybody was scared about, what Timothy Leary was saying, is that, man, you drop it in the water supply, people are going to go crazy. And so we need some kind of balance between pleasure and spirituality and living on the earth and, suiting up and showing up and doing things maybe that I don't feel like doing.
Right.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, well, everything got split into duality in this plane. So it got split into, either hedonistic pleasure or what would you call it? I mean, parsimonious non-sexuality, right? but okay, but of course you want the yin yang to come together. It has to balance it. You don't want to be at one end of the thing or the other. We have to come together. The yin yang, the opposites are contained within that whole, which is a womb. That structure of the circle is the womb of Mother Creator. She is the one that actually contains and okayed, the creation of all of these negative things as well, because she gave free will. She's the parthenogenetic universal creatrix.
Well, let me think out loud for a second, because there's a lot in my experience that I don't have, that I haven't been able to, and I lean on William Blake here, where there's plenty with this eye that I haven't seen, but I certainly haven't. I certainly keep asking these questions, and I've built a lot of my life around being in a pretty inspirited place. But when talk of kind of interdimensional beings comes up, I say, okay, what the hell is this? So when I'm thinking out loud, not only do I have that part of me that's like, well, come on, like, what are we talking about here? But then I think about the way I probably would have been thinking when there was a shift between what we currently call classical and Newtonian physics and quantum physics. And the word quantum is used a lot. People tend to, like, quantum is this signifier for kind of another dimension or whatever but I do know that on some level, if I take some proton and I'm spinning it in a certain direction, and the sister proton or neutron or whatever, 100 kilometers away, starts spinning the same direction I change the axis on, like, that's weird shit. And I don't understand that. And so I at least can kind of go, okay, I have to have faith here that there are plenty of things in this world that I can't see, touch, feel, taste, know, measure, and understand, given my consciousness. But how do you get into this? Because this is blowing my mind.
And they're acting on it all the time, acting on us all the time. I mean, quantum physics is spirituality's best friend, because as what it's going to unfold gets weirder and weirder, you're going to realize, whoa, they're talking about dimensional shifts and time anomalies and matter spirit interface. And oh my gosh, so this is going to be the common person's entree into this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And again, a lot of people are accessing this through sacred medicines or other kinds of states, right? So that you can see it, you can know it, you can experience it. And I would, to bring it back to Mother Mary, I
Okay.
believe that she was working on the quantum level when she conceived Jesus. There was a whole ritual that was set forth, that she was involved in, that involved 7 other women at the same time. And she's the one who ended up conceiving, and Elizabeth, her, as it turns out, aunt, who conceived John the Baptist. They were working with the light matter womb spirit interface in unbelievable ways. And this is why you have the entry of the quote Archangel Gabriel into the process, because there were interdimensional beings assisting with this practice. It wasn't just the woman kind of trying to figure it out all herself. She was opening up into this other domain, and there were these high level beings, angelics, helping.
How do you?
That's why we have the Archangel Gabriel. It's just another way of looking at, why is the Archangel Gabriel there? Um, as
So
more than just a little sweet kind of story, like, oh, the Archangel Gabriel. It's like, whoa, holy crap! Like a whole huge technology was going on here, a quantum level.
how do you get around? So the way in which people were writing then, let's say these texts, my understanding is it's not the same kind of imaginative space that we tend to write in or from today. So how do you get around the interpretation problem, which is, are these texts literally true, or are they mythically true? And if we try to apply kind of scientific rational truth today to text, that, like, how does that make sense to you?
Well, just looking at the infancy gospel of James / birth of Mary, that particular text, like when you read it just straight on, which it's at the end of my book, it's like, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. It kind of chronicles a story here. But when I bored down into each word and phrase, and I showed what was going on, and the symbols and everything, what I realized was that this writer was actually very mystical. I mean, he was privy to some things. Otherwise, why would he have been talking about the laurel tree? Otherwise, why would he have been talking about any of these other symbols and events that happened? Why was he talking about that Anne had to put on her wedding dress before she conceived Mary, right? These things. Like, this was a person who spoke parsimoniously, with few words, but conveyed a ton of information. So I think that this person was schooled to some degree in the mysteries. This was just the way it was expressed. And what I can say is that there's this one section of this gospel that's completely wild out there mystical. He describes a situation that Joseph has. He's left Mary in the cave. She's giving birth, but she needs a midwife. So he's looking all over the countryside to find a midwife. And in the middle of this, probably because he's hot, who knows if he's had enough water, whatever, under the hot sun, he goes into an altered state of consciousness. And it is the wildest thing to read it. Now, if you just read it going, that is just so weird. But if you really penetrate into what he's saying, it's like, oh my God, he's giving you this mystical revelation of Joseph's mind got opened, and he saw time and space going into this quantum physics anomalous situation where he saw people moving and not moving at the same time, eating and not eating at the same time. I mean, it's just this wild thing. So he went into it, right, without drugs. So things like that are very mystical on the part of these older authors, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And even there are some of the other writers. Is it Josephus? Not Josephus, but there's another ancient Hebrew writer. It'll come to me. I don't know why I always blank out on his name. He's talking about these deep mysteries with these Hebrew women, saying that basically they were all virgin birth priestesses. You know, how did he know about that? So these people have been accessing, and even, you know, the mystical encounters that we have in the Bible of these guys who go into these altered state of experiences and what they're describing. So it's always been there. It's been there throughout time in all of these texts.
Well,
And
and
that's
that's
where
the. Sorry, go on.
I come in on this particular text with Mary, where I look at what it's actually saying, you know, from the perspective of a woman who has opened into fifth dimensional consciousness and can understand and can bring forth more information for people who may not be privy to that. That's the whole point of the book. And to say Mary actually did this, and thinking people can understand that she gave a divine birth. This is how she did it. This is what was involved. These were the consequences. This is what she endured, etc.
Yeah, I guess that's part of the interesting piece is that when I read those texts, I have a part of my mind that's wondering what is literally, measurably true and what is mystically true or mythically true. And what I try to tell myself is it doesn't matter.
Right.
But that's kind of what I'm getting into when I start talking to people who actually can translate text, who actually know history, who actually know the classics. There seems to be a more porous and I seem to be in a lot of my preconceived notions. I seem to be a little wrong over what was literally true and what was not, or what was mythically true, and that continues to really blow my mind. So I have that doubting part of me that's like, why do we have to define what is measurably or I think I say measurably because I want to use like the scientific rational mind. Like if you can see it, taste it, touch it, feel it, measure it, then it's quote true. Or the mythic mindset, which would say something like, no, I mean, there are truths that can be communicated by means that aren't related to a rational, measurable truth.
Mm-hmm.
But and that the interesting thing that you do in your book is you talk about um, the immaculate conception as something that can be manifested measurably, conception measurably through a process of initiating a woman into a tradition where she has gone through years and years of training,
Yeah,
and then she can give birth to this human child,
that's
which,
right.
which again blows my mind. But we do see it in nature. I don't have enough training in the world of biology to know what the hell I'm talking about there.
Yeah, there are some creatures that do it, and there are some creatures that could be induced to do it. Be that as it may, though, we are talking here about a spiritual process, practice, training, where you're bringing spirit into matter, which happens every time a woman conceives anyway. But this is just a different mechanism by which spirit comes into the flesh. It's just an alternate mechanism that allows, because of its technology, it allows for a different vibrational being to come in than perhaps the ordinary child, even though there are many extraordinary children coming in through regular intercourse. And one could say all children are extraordinary,
Mm-hmm.
but we're talking about degrees of masterhood that a being will come in with already, degrees of awareness and awakeness that a being will come in with. And Christ came in very awake. Mary herself came in very awake. Even though they both had to learn and be trained during their lives, they did not have to go through quite the levels of breaking the barnacles off that most of us do in order to, you know, be able to open our consciousness. And I go back to Jung, where I think he was trying to toe the line in the scientific world, even though he broke from Freud early on because he was way too mystical and out there. I think he was still trying to have some level of scientific credibility. That's
Definitely.
why that red book did not come out. The red book is the red pill.
Yeah.
Okay. It did not come out until after he died because he knew that it would just destroy his reputation or whatever, because he was showing that he was integrated. He was integrated between this dimension and the other dimension. And sometimes it was really uncomfortable for him to maintain his bodily integrity or his sanity, but he was somehow able to do that. And I think a lot of us are awakening, and we're trying to maintain our bodily integrity and our ego consciousness while also opening to these other possibilities and things that seem counter three-dimensional, counter biological, counter material Newtonian physics rules, right? And so these priestesses have always been connected with these realms, just like shamans all over the world are. The dream time people in Australia, the
Mm-hmm.
Aboriginals,
Mm-hmm.
all the shamans all over. I mean, of course, this is why they had to be attacked and decimated. The Native Americans, there was once deep, deep connectivity with these other realms.
Well, that gets off into an amazing conversation, actually.
It's
That,
often an amazing
yeah.
conversation. I mean, I hope this is interesting to your people. We are going through many different zones of this. Uh, I think that what my new book is all about, and really what all my books are about, is again this interface of human divine. What does it mean? How do we bring different orders of beings into the planet? How do we bring ourselves to the level of becoming that different order of being? You see, because Jesus and Mary, as I see it, they were not here to be worshiped, they were here to be modeled. They were here for us to match their vibration, come up to their vibration, whatever that meant, in various different ways, but as a means, not as a morality story, but as a means of coming into our own full divine
Yeah.
blueprint nature. That's, I think, what we're all about, and we're on the threshold of at this crisis time right now.
Well, I know that anytime we got about 15 more minutes, so I want to be conscientious of being able to close out and give you the opportunity to direct anybody listening or watching to wherever you would like to direct them. But I know the act of writing a book is something that there's a reason why mystics have tended to write things down. So there's some kind of discovery. I'm curious what you experienced or discovered through writing this book in particular.
Well, this really opened the door to me about who Mary is, who Mary was, and who Mary shall be in my life and the life of other people, as an exemplar of a female who is at her most elevated peak, a priestess who was full throttle on every cylinder was functioning for her. So it began a new relationship that I could have with Mary by applying the research that I had already done, to her domain. Of course, when I started on researching on virgin birth, of course, Mary was really automatically there.
Right.
But it's taken, a decade before things have been right for me to write this book about Mary. It was one thing to write about ancient Greece, but now Mary. And it's sort of corresponding with this whole worldwide movement of the exaltation of women and, restoring women to their rightful places as priestesses. So it's been, far more than an intellectual exercise for me, although I love that. I love to do all those calisthenics, those intellectual, I've got my intellectual chops. I mean, I have my PhD and so forth. I know how to analyze this, that, and the other thing. But this project was in a way an integration project for me.
Yeah.
And like I said, my next book will be even further, the further explorations of Mother Mary as a mentor. But I think this piece needed to get out there first to establish Mary as a real bona fide practitioner of virgin birth, to present an argument that thinking people could get with, could explore, could look at. And it's just been fascinating for me, a fascinating process. I mean, I loved it. I wrote this book very quickly in a matter of 4 or 5 months, and it just in kind of a static state, just wow, and I thought that I had gone through it all and knew what I was going to say, but even more would come through as I was going through the writing process.
Right.
I was essentially, opening to those intuitional realms, and more was pouring through. So that's a little bit about what the experience has been like for me and has meant to me. This whole excursion for me into divine birth has been quite ecstatic, because it would really open my consciousness, and that in and of itself has been a kind of an erotic experience. I mean, all while I was writing, starting back in 2003, when I really started investigating divine birth in a serious way, and I would go through the research and the books and have carts of books coming back and forth from the library. And I would be intellectually writing, and then I would receive all these downpours, right? So it was this figure eight process, intellectual, intuitional. Sometimes I would literally have to lie down on my office floor just to breathe and integrate it all, going, this is so enormous. Mm-hmm. And the implications are so enormous. And the implications of this book are so enormous because, of course, this is not just about Mother Mary. And as I write a little bit in my introduction, this is about what's possible for any woman who wants to go on this type of a holy womb path, for the purposes, perhaps, of bringing in a higher level avatar to the planet. So I know of women, and as I write about at the beginning of the book, I know of one woman who did conceive spontaneously. There's a whole story with that. I know of other women who have conceived through various means, right? So this is something, this is real. There is a possibility here. And this is a new technology that we need to open up and unfold again, that conscious, ethical women need to return to. And it's a tradition that, of course, needs to be protected.
Thank you for writing it. Because what I hear in what you just said about the process, I tend to say this in circles of friends and colleagues, is the divine conception of writing a book, right, of creating a song, of the act of creation itself is on one level what we're talking about. And yes, as somebody who's written a dissertation, it feels like giving birth. In a spiritual, intellectual kind. I am not some guy who's saying I can imagine what it feels like to give birth, but I know what it feels like to create something and give birth to that. And
yes, because ultimately it's really about the entire creative process itself, whether it's a physical conception, whether it's a conception of a project and a manifestation of a project, whatever level of creativity you want to talk about. Yeah, it is creativity at its apex in a way when it comes to divine birth, because it's really literalizing spirit into material form in the human flesh, and that's a pretty big feat.
Yeah, it sure is. Well, so where do you want to send people?
All right, well, so I am the director of Seven Sisters Mystery School, and that is an enterprise that has various courses online. I have one that would be very interesting to if people want to go deeper into Mother Mary, and it's called the Mother Mary Mystery Teachings. And then I have another one called the Divine Birth Mysteries audio series, which is kind of that backstory summary of my first two books in a very digestible, fascinating form and entertaining. And then there's another one on the Holy Womb Chakra teachings, which the Holy Womb, that's a whole other study. And I provide ancient methods of activating and purifying the womb, which would be part of the steps along the way to anybody who wants to have a divine child, either conceiving one with a man or eventually conceiving one parthenogenetically. So, you know, people can explore around on my site, and there are many free offerings. I also give one-on-one sessions, and I will be continuing to teach on into the future. And if you really want that wild, up to the minute next level teaching, I have a course called Accelerating into Fifth Dimensional Consciousness. So that's for the real cosmonauts, I would say.
Say your website real quick. What is it?
SevenSistersMysteryschool.com.
Great. And I'll put it in the look below in the resources and liner notes.
Thank you so
And
much.
I enjoyed your books. This is a treat. You know, I want to thank Brian Marescu for hooking us up, and apparently we are all going to celebrate together one day.
Oh yeah, so let it be so. Yes.
Marguerite, thank you for being here.
Work. Thank you so much for having me, John. Control.